And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is September the 8th. The 251st day of the year. 114 days remain to the year's over with. Now today and yesterday are very unusual in that you're going to see the blood moon. That's when the shadow of the earth falls over the moon. We're between the sun and the moon. Well, holidays, observances. We've got Star Trek Day. Whether it's the original series or whichever offshoot you like. It honors the progressive cultural touchstone created by Gene Roddenberry in the 1960s. I didn't get a chance to know him. I knew his son. It's Actors Day. Take part in a local theater production. Maybe auditioning or simply supporting local actors. Give some appreciation to this difficult but entertaining skill. And it's National Ampersand Day, World Physical Therapy Day. Physical therapy can help everything from minor pains to serious injuries. And understanding how the body works can help you keep your body healthy and comfortable. I've had physical therapy several times, doing it right now. National Iguana Awareness Day. Learn how to properly care for and love and treat this magnificent creature known as an iguana. Decide if they'd be the right fit for your home. National Dog Walker Appreciation Day. Pardon Day. Be polite and make sure you say pardon and excuse me when necessary. But more importantly, examine the grudges you hold against folks and see who you need to pardon. We've also got National Boss/Employee Exchange Day. Swap roles with your boss, or if you're the boss, then with your employee. Gain some perspective on how to make everybody's life better through a work-life balance. National Pediatric Hematology Oncology Nurses Day. And a National Literacy Day. Go to the library, volunteer for an event, donate books or money to help improve the world's ability to read and give people better opportunities in life. Crayfish Party. Chef Appreciation Week. Fiesta de Vino. Now this is an interesting undertaking. It's a wine festival. Celebrates Madeira's world-renowned wine. Both the locals as well as visitors are fascinated. Red Valley. National Child Protection Week. Toronto International Film Festival. It captures the spirit of cinema. It's celebrated annually. Draws a global audience of filmmakers and actors and fans. It's a place where emerging talents can shine alongside some of the established stars. The Folic Acid Awareness Week. Now, folic acid is an important acid, especially for those who are pregnant or may become pregnant. This B vitamin helps the body produce red blood cells, supports the development of the brain and spine in unborn babies, and is most critical in the early weeks of pregnancy, often before somebody knows that they are pregnant. National Waffle Week. Fiesta de San Pacho. It's a celebration that fills the streets of Quibdó. It celebrates St. Francis of Assisi. The city becomes a stage where people showcase their rich heritage through parades and performances. Definitely is a fascinating event for everything I've heard. Know Your Numbers Week, talking specifically about blood pressure. Navasard, National Assisted Living Week, bunks across America. And for those that are not familiar with that one, it's with the belief that sleeping in a bed is a basic health need for children. The folks behind Bunks Across America have organized this annual event to provide beds for children in need. I spent some time in bunk beds. It was fascinating. Famous people born on this date: Bernie Sanders, Patsy Cline, Pink, David Arquette, Chum Lee, Wiz Khalifa, and Gaten Matarazzo. Well, with all that having been said, let's go look at stories in the news. Well, President Trump has called for action after the stabbing of a Ukrainian refugee at on the Charlotte train. The young lady was actually running from the war in Ukraine, working at a pizzeria to support herself. 23-year-old Ukrainian. The stabbing happened last month in Charlotte, North Carolina. Said the U.S. has to act against evil people for the good of the country. He said, we're all people of religion, but there are evil people here. The suspect, identified as 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown, was arrested shortly after the stabbing, hospitalized before being arrested on a charge of first-degree murder. Appeals court upholds a $83.3 million Trump defamation judgment in the Jean Carroll case. He's still facing having to pay that $83 million to writer E. Jean Carroll after a federal appeals court rejected his challenge of a defamation verdict against him on Monday. That ruling from the Second U.S. Court of Appeals upholds a lower court decision finding that he did, in fact, defame Carroll. Trump's lawyers argued his comments about Carroll were protected by presidential immunity and the verdict in the case was unjust. Three-judge panel rejected both of those claims. Well, Supreme Court allows Trump's ICE raids to resume in California. The High Court, in a 6-3 decision issued along ideological lines, is temporary while the case proceeds to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Came after a federal judge in July blocked immigration and customs enforcement from conducting raids in Los Angeles County. They found the plaintiffs would likely succeed in their argument that the raids violated the Fourth Amendment. Ninth Circuit upheld that order. It left the Trump administration no way out but to turn to the Supreme Court. Well, there's a woman who's quelled internet hate after being identified as a Phillies Karen. She said she's a Red Sox fan. This controversy is about a Phillies fan who demanded a father give her a home run ball during the team's game against the Miami Marlins. Fans are irate as the woman who marched over to the father and who took the ball and gave it to his young son. They all tried to find out who she was. Created an internet rumor that pointed to a woman named Cheryl Richardson Wagner. She pushed back against the online hate with a hilarious post on Facebook. She said, "I'm not the crazy Philly mom, but I sure would love to be as thin as she is and move as fast." She says she's a Red Sox fan. Well, he wound up getting an autographed bat from his baseball hero. Well, Department of Homeland Security has confirmed there's a probe of a former undocumented Boston lawmaker sentenced in a corruption case. The Cape Verde-born Boston councilor Tania Fernandez Anderson pled guilty early this year in relation to what the Boston Herald described as a kickback scheme she carried out in a city hall bathroom. Libs of TikTok, social media account known for criticizing liberal hypocrisy, run by activist Chaya Reshik, highlighted Anderson last week and said that the source had told her that Department of Homeland Security was investigating Anderson. Well, residents in an exclusive enclave are demanding the Democratic mayor act about the crime surge. This is a ritzy area of Los Angeles. Residents are getting frustrated with local leaders such as Democratic Mayor Karen Bass, who's done nothing to stop the crime surge. Call for increased security in the Encino neighborhood of Los Angeles comes after longtime American Idol music producer Robin Kay and her husband, Thomas DeLuca, were found dead inside their home on July 14th. Well, William Shatner was interviewed and said he's earned $0 from Star Trek reruns despite decades of syndication. He said nobody knew about reruns. The concept of syndication only came in after Star Trek was canceled, when somebody from the union said, wait a minute, you're replaying all those films, all these old shows. It was a big strike, but at the end, the unions secured residential fees shortly after Star Trek finished, so he didn't benefit. The Supreme Court's temporarily green-lighted Trump's firing of Biden-appointed FTC commissioner. The Federal Trade Commission, this member was fired without cause as the High Court inches toward revisiting a landmark ruling about executive power over terminations. Well, a housing developer has warned about hopelessness in the housing market. He says it's threatening the American dream. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent confirms administration considering national housing emergency this fall. He said, I think for sure we're in a national housing emergency. I think we've been here for some time. Name is Dan Coakley, property manager at Group Affordable's principal. Well, two Marquette men, lacrosse players, were killed in a car crash, according to officials. They were identified as Noah Snyder and Scott Mashaud. The crash was near the university's main campus in Milwaukee. Let's see what else we got. Jury's going to be chosen for the Ryan Ruth trial. He's the second individual who attempted to assassinate President Trump. The jury selection began today in Fort Pierce, Florida. He's accused of plotting to assassinate President Trump at his West Palm Beach golf club. Jury selection is going to go through Wednesday. Both prosecutors and Routh himself are going to question the jurors. He's opted to represent himself. Well, Democratic governor breaks his silence on the murder of a Ukrainian refugee after social media backlash. That's North Carolina Governor Josh Stein broke his silence over the murder of a Ukrainian refugee on a Charlotte train. He faced heated criticism over the weekend for not speaking out earlier, despite the release of a brutal video of the attack. Well, former University of Kentucky athlete competed just months before police allegedly found a dead infant in her closet. She was former University of Kentucky student athlete Lakin Snelling, seen performing in her school's stunt team months before detectives say they found her newborn infant inside a closet wrapped up in a trash bag. She was taken into custody August 31st. Well, Wisconsin resident say there's a mystery company's $1.6 billion data center being proposed for Wisconsin farmland. Residents are not happy. More than 300 acres of farmland already annexed as Facebook group opposing the project gains thousands of members. People living in this Midwest city, known for its natural beauty and outdoor recreation, are alarmed at the proposed data center. $1.6 billion. A D.C. pizzeria owner says hosting President Trump will be a privilege. Rejects fears about a political maelstrom. He denied having any concerns over potentially hosting President Trump on Friday, after a local magazine referenced her business in an article about the potential political maelstrom. Well, let's see. Florida launches firearms and ammunition sales tax exemption until the end of 2025. So if you want a gun or ammunition, you need to get out there and get it now. No price caps. A woman has been found who was missing. She competed in a YouTube survival show, rescued nearly 18 hours after she went missing on a cold, rain-soaked Michigan forest over the weekend. This 36-year-old woman, whose identity has not been released, disappeared in the Pigeon River Forest in Charlton Township at about 5 p.m. Friday. She left the designated base camp to search for water. That's according to the Otsego County Sheriff's Office. When she failed to come back, hosts of the contest began to search for her. After about 12 hours, they called the sheriff's office. Officers immediately launched a coordinated search effort involving multiple agencies, but she was eventually found. Well, CBS News has appointed an ombudsman to advocate for journalistic integrity and transparency after all the controversies. They hired Kenneth Weinstein to serve as an ombudsman and advocate for journalistic integrity, as I said. He previously served as president and CEO of the Hudson Institute. Was chosen by the parent company of Paramount to serve as an ombudsman. We'll see how that works out. Well, Comer vows accountability. President Trump rips scandal after a bombshell report on Biden's auto pen pardons. House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer of Republican Kentucky said his panel is wrapping up its investigation into President Biden's use of the auto pen after a new report revealed concerns raised within the administration itself. Well, Steven Tyler performed Ozzy Osbourne tribute after a vocal cord injury forced Aerosmith to retire from touring. So he's doing what he does best, getting up there and screaming. He's a 77-year-old rock legend. Doing Sunday's MTV Video Awards. Tyler, along with Joe Perry and Youngblood and Nuno Bettencourt, honored the late Ozzy Osbourne with an emotional tribute performance of Mama, I'm Coming Home. This marks Tyler's first award show performance since Aerosmith announced the band would retire from touring after Tyler injured his larynx while singing on stage. Now, Candace Cameron Bure has deleted a bathing suit photo she had posted. That's after online trolls commented on her body. She's 49 years old. And Saturday, she explained why she decided to delete that photo in a bathing suit after one fan asked her why she removed it from her Instagram. You know, she's an attractive lady. There was no cause for doing that. But unfortunately, she's another one who's been overcome with religious fervor. Well, your late-night cheese habit could be sparking wild dreams and restless sleep, according to experts. Study from University of Montreal's Dreams and Nightmares Laboratory found that certain late-night foods can induce bizarre and unpleasant dreams. One top offender was dairy, whether eaten as desserts or as a treat. Well, psychedelic drug popular in the 1960s could ease anxiety as doctors share warnings. You're talking about LSD, also known as acid. It can reduce anxiety. This marks the first ever trial to evaluate the safety and efficiency of MN-120. That's a pharmaceutical formulation of LSD. So maybe we can all get high and just have a good time. Well, a man fishing with his grandson uncovered a mystery wreckage in the mudflats, according to an archaeologist. Thomas Peterson, a self-described Florida redneck, told Fox 13 Tampa Bay he recently found what may be a 19th century rum runner. Discovered the ship remains in Arapica, a small community about 50 miles north of Tampa. Wreckage was found at low tide. Well, let's see. A Sister Wife star claims that Cody Brown withheld affection and neglected parental duties in a scathing new memoir. Christine Brown Woolley instantly knew when her husband, Cody Brown, found his soulmate. 53-year-old who chronicled her polygamous marriage in a TLC reality series Sister Wives is sharing her story in a new book called Sister Wife, a memoir of faith, family, and finding freedom. Lays bare her strict Mormon upbringing, her decision to walk away from a 25-year marriage, and her discovery of love in a monogamous relationship. It's out there for everybody to see. Well, Howard Stern's at it again. He reveals he's still a Sirius after faking out his listeners. He's staying with Sirius XM following months of speculation about his future with the satellite radio company. The show opened up with a prank staged by Andy Cohen, who joked he'd replace Stern with a new program called Andy 100. Well, the teens' medical invention has saved lives. You know, what if stopping life-threatening bleeding could be as simple as injecting a gel into the vein? That's the promise of Traumago, a groundbreaking plant-based bleeding control gel now being used by first responders across the country. Developed by Cresalon CEO and co-founder Joe Landolina, it works in seconds to control bleeding from gunshot wounds and other traumatic injuries. And we saw the debacle when folks tried to mess with Cracker Barrel. Hooters has now come up with a plan to make to change to the iconic orange shorts. Wants to make them less revealing as part of a brand rebirth. You know, for decades, these orange shorts worn by the Hooters waitresses have been calling card for the American restaurant chain. They served as a beacon for the so-called original restaurant establishment and part of what makes Hooters delightfully tacky. Well, this is just another case of let's fix what's not broken. All right. Well, the mugshots of two of those who killed a Capitol intern have been revealed as the manhunt continues for the third one. Police released mugshots of two 17-year-olds accused in a June shooting death of a Capitol Hill intern in Washington, D.C. The victim, 21-year-old University of Massachusetts at Amherst student Eric Tarpinian Jakim, intern for Representative Ron Estes, Republican of Kansas, fatally shot June 30th, about a mile from the White House. Suspects Kelvin Thomas Jr. of Southeast D.C. and Jalen Lucas of Northwest D.C. are pictured in the mugshots. They were arrested on Friday and charged as adults in premeditated first-degree murder while armed. Police are still searching for Naquan Antonio Lucas, 18, who's wanted on a D.C. Superior Court warrant for premeditated first-degree murder while armed. The suspects also injured a woman and a 16-year-old boy during the attack. Well, I think that has got our news segment. You know, we've been talking about a lot of strange topics over the years because we've done over 2,000 shows. Now, if you all are listening and you have problems hearing me clearly, let me know. We're working on a sound right now. Well, we've got a number of stories about police interacting with the paranormal. You know, since they're normally out at night, certainly they, if anybody's going to come in contact with the bizarre, it could well be the police. Well, we're going to start out with a story about a police call from rural Illinois. Police officer and his partner were working the night shift, and normally the night shift is a quiet affair, dealing with the occasional loud drunk and speeding car, sometimes a break-in. This particular call came in saying there was a suspected break-in at a local morgue of all places. Now, that's a bit of an odd place to break into, admittedly, but there are a good number of chemicals inside which may be of interest to drug addicts. When the officers took the call and headed to the morgue to investigate, when they got there, they found the custodian standing outside, looking more than a little shaken. He said he was mopping the floors when he saw something move in his peripheral vision. Looked up and saw somebody run across the hallway from one side to the other and disappear into a room. Well, due to the fact that as he mopped each section, he cut out the lights, he couldn't give a good description of the person because he couldn't see him clearly, but he could tell there was a figure there. He was absolutely positive he saw somebody, and being alone and unarmed, he decided discretion was the better part of valor and called the police. Well, the two officers figured it was probably some kids breaking in for the fun, or maybe the custodian was even seeing things, but the man was certain enough about what he had seen to convince the officers they needed to check it out. Well, they started by verbally warning anybody inside the building to show themselves. They didn't get an answer other than hearing their voice echo back to them. The officers, along with the custodian, did a sweep of the building by walking the central corridor, hands on their guns, checking each of the side rooms as they came across them. Most were labs used for analysis. Some were storage for tools or administrative files. And as they moved about, they turned on the lights to ensure they didn't miss anybody who might be hiding. Well, one officer opened the door to a blackened room and flipped on the light switch. Found he was in an empty waiting room for relatives of the deceased. He went through the room and checked every place a person could possibly hide. And as he was doing that, his partner suddenly started shouting, "Hey, stop, turn around." Well, he spun around and saw his partner with his gun raised, pointing toward the end of the corridor. He came out of the door and his partner yelled, "She went around the corner," indicating the left-hand route at the end of the corridor. The custodian, who was right behind him, said, "That way's a dead end, so escape from there." Well, knowing they had the intruder cornered, they advanced down the corridor, called out to the woman to reassure her she'd be safe. She came out and surrendered. First officer went to the end of the corridor and peered around the corner. Saw the woman standing at the end. The lights were still off in that part of the building, which allowed him to only get a rough idea about her appearance and the fact she had long, fair hair. Well, wanting to see if he could talk to her to convince her to leave with him quietly, he stepped out behind the corner. As soon as she saw him, she pulled open a big gray door behind her and ran through it and slammed the door. Well, the officer ran up to the door and discovered it was locked. He banged on it for a little while and called out to the woman to show herself, but didn't get a response. His partner and the custodian came up, and the officer said, "She's in here and the door's locked." Well, the custodian was a little puzzled because apparently that door couldn't be locked from the inside. Custodian unlocked and two officers went inside, guns raised. Well, shining their flashlights around the room, they revealed everything except the woman they were trying to find. The place was eerie in the lights of the flashlight, and one officer felt it was strangely cold, even for a morgue. Custodian came in behind him and flicked the lights on, and it was largely empty, some workspace along the sides, equipment against one wall, and two gurneys for bodies sitting in the middle of the room. Now, one gurney was covered with a sheet, and there was a body shape underneath it. Well, both officers decided their culprit was probably under the sheet, because that was a clever place to hide, especially if the room had been more regularly used. But as it was, they were pretty sure they had their suspect. As they approached the gurney, they realized something was wrong. There was an unearthly stench emanating from the shape. It wasn't a smell from somebody alive or even somebody unwashed and sweaty, but it was rather the smell of rotten death. When the officers pulled the sheet off the body, there was certainly a woman lying there. In fact, it was the woman they'd been chasing through the building. There was a toe tag hanging off her foot, said she'd been dead for over 4 days. And certainly that would give you cause for discussion. Well, our next story comes from a small rural town in Nebraska. It's the early 1990s. At the time of the incident, the town had a number of abandoned buildings, and police had the duty to inspect each one. The steady shift of heavy industry away from town had meant many families moved away, vacating their homes. One building in particular had a problem with copper thieves in the past, so the officers were advised to keep a close eye on it. One officer, out on his own due to the fact it was a small town and was a small police force, was making his rounds in the evening when he passed by this house. It sat on the corner of a lot and allowed all 4 sides of the building to be visible at one time as he drove by. His first pass was at about 7 that evening. The building was run down with flaking paint and boarded up windows, just another empty shell with no activity. Well, it was beginning to snow, and it was starting to pile up, especially around the houses. They hadn't been cleared, or the paths hadn't been salted. So the officer was settling in for another long, dull night. About 2 hours later, he passed by again on his patrol route and noticed the back door of that house was standing wide open. And he knew it wasn't open the last time he passed that house, so he came to the conclusion somebody had broken in. Pulling over to investigate, he wondered whether there could be anything left to steal inside that house. Strangely, when he reached the house, there were no footprints in the snow around that open door. Now, he was a little confused, but not especially worried. He called dispatch and told him he was investigating an open door at the property's address and asked for a county sheriff to start heading his way. As he walked up to the door, still wondering about the lack of footprints, he flashed his flashlight inside. Various thieves throughout the last few years had gutted the place. The plaster walls were all torn down and piles of rubble and debris accumulated on the floor. He didn't see anybody in the room or any footprints in the dust on the floor. With the lack of prints in the snow as well as on the floor, the officer figured the wind might have blown the door open. He was about to close the door and secure it when he heard a loud thump from the upper floor of that house and a sound like children laughing. He called up to them, but didn't get a response. Only more childlike sounds of playing and laughing. So he called into dispatch, alerted them he thought the intruders were just some kids playing in the house. Made his way through the kitchen to the living room where the stairs were located. Checked every corner of the first floor as he went. Many of the floorboards were rotted and he had to pick his way delicately through the rooms. As he's moving throughout the house, he heard noises upstairs twice more. Without a verbal response to his inquiries, he started to think it might be an animal. But he was still positive. It sounded to him like children laughing. Well, whatever may be the situation, he figured he had to check it out anyway, so he started to head upstairs to find the source of the sounds. And as he went up the stairs, it immediately got very quiet up there. Now, the stairs weren't especially steep, and he did hear a thump in the bedroom on his left as he hit the landing. Not sure what he might find, he tentatively approached the door to the room and peeked around the side. The room was empty except for a pile of debris and a few bits of furniture. Oddly enough, there was a new-looking piece of paper on top of the pile of debris. Well, he went over to inspect the paper and found it was a page torn out of a children's book. Most disturbingly, though, the picture had a child's drawing of a police officer on it. Hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he heard children's laughter right behind him, as if it was in the same room. Spinning around, his gun raised, he didn't see anybody. He decided at that point it was time to leave and told dispatch it was a false alarm and told himself he's never going back in that house again. Well, back in the late 1980s, in a middle-sized town in Oregon, which was originally settled by Finnish immigrants, there was a well-known old man who lived in one of the Victorian-style townhouses common in the early 1900s. He'd lived in that house since he was 2 years old. A lot of folks said he and the house had become one in a way, even started to look like each other. Both were getting gray and wearing down with age. Born about 1915, the man had seen a lot of changes happen to his town. And though he wasn't known as a hermit, he had a semi-active social life. He did carry a distinctly racist streak, though, in his interactions with others. And despite his views on race, he was relatively well liked around town. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with terminal colon cancer and given 6 months to live. Well, that news came as a blow to the community. Man spent a good deal of time saying his goodbyes to people and generally making his peace before his final day. The night it happened, it was cold and clear. About 3 in the morning, the police got a call from a concerned neighbor explaining she hadn't seen the old man leave his house in a couple of days and hadn't seen any lights inside the house either. Fearing the worst, 2 officers were dispatched to his house to check on him. When they got there, multiple neighbors were awoken by the lights of the squad car and went out to see what was going on. Realizing what had probably happened, a lot of folks began to cry. 2 officers entered the man's house through the front door, which was unlocked, immediately greeted by a massive elk head mounted in the entranceway to the house. Its creepy, staring eyes made the officers feel like it was actually watching them. Passing it by, making their way upstairs, they went to the old man's room and found him lying on the floor beside his bed. It was still made up. They checked for a pulse, confirmed he was dead. Somewhat sad, they called into the station and asked for an ambulance to pick up the body to deliver to the coroner. At that point in time, the town only employed a couple of paramedics, so only 1 paramedic was on the scene. 2 officers were asked by the paramedic to help them carry the body downstairs to the ambulance. Well, at that point in time, things started to get odd. When the 3 men began to make their way downstairs with the body, they began to have problems. They had to struggle. It was then the lead officer realized something was different about the elk head they saw on the way into the house. The head was no longer sitting upright as when they had originally entered. Instead, it was turned to the side. And underneath the head, something was written in a wet red print, ASUA. Now, this officer's hair standing on end knew the word from the Finnish language his grandparents still spoke. ASUA means stay or remain. The officer reached out and swiped a little bit of that red stuff off the wall and sniffed it and realized it was blood dripping from the elk head. Well, the paramedic and the second officer were trying to get the stretcher with the body down onto the front porch. And as he stepped out onto the porch, every single window in the house imploded. Deafening racket. The officer by the ambulance watched as the porch of the house collapsed. It wasn't like the porch gave way. It's like the house just gave up and collapsed. The whole porch in front of the house slumped forward with the sound of tearing wood, creating a slope up to the second floor windows. Well, dust scattered in every direction. At the sound, people came back out of their houses to help the officers. He tried to find his partner and the paramedic. Went around to the side of the collapsed porch, and in the gap between the fallen roof and the still standing walls of the porch, he found his partner, who was just beside himself. He kept babbling, and when finally the officer could figure out what he was saying he sat up. Well, after a little while of calming him down, the officer managed to find out what his partner had actually seen. Apparently, as the porch collapsed, the old man's body clawed its way out of the body bag and started screaming. The first officer checked the body bag, and sure enough, it was torn to pieces, and the body was sitting up, its face in a rictus scream of terror. Horrified, the officer threw a tarp over the body to hide it and went to help his partner, who wouldn't go anywhere near the house again. Well, the other ambulance in town came out to help and took the officer and the paramedic away to a trauma center to assess any injuries and First officer had to deal with all the paperwork, although what he might have written was anybody's guess. I mean, how exactly do you report a house collapsing on its own and a dead body tearing its way out of the body bag? Well, that story has become a local legend around town, and unsurprisingly, the house is still standing as it was left that night. Nobody dares go near it again. Well, our next story comes from a cold November night in New Hampshire. Houses are thin out among the lake and the forest. The darkness and the cold there aren't like in the cities. It's a lethal, impenetrable barrier to anybody unprepared to face the conditions, and a lot of folks have died when they underestimated the power of Mother Nature. Well, the police got a call about a little girl who had been seen wandering around on her own near one of the lakes. And of course, this was a serious problem, considering the weather was dangerously cold and a child near the water could fall in and drown without anybody finding her again. And the lakes around these parts were deep and dark, and once something sank there was a slim chance it would ever see the light of day again. And naturally, every available officer in the area responded to that call. 2 officers who had children of their own and wanted to ensure the little girl was found were the first ones on the scene. Well, they got to the lake after a long, dark drive. The weather had been threatening snow for a couple of days, and they were hoping it was going to hold off till they finished their search. When they arrived, they reported to dispatch and began looking for the little girl. Well, a lot of houses around the lake, and it was pitch black, causing them to be a little leery as they picked their way through the undergrowth and the marshy areas beside the lake. Eventually, they got to a dirt beach with a little clearing where the wind moved the water frequently enough to stop anything from taking root there. And they searched the area, checking out any hollows or dark spots the girl could be hiding in. Didn't find anything. As they searched, they discussed what a little girl would be doing out there in the middle of a cold winter's night. Maybe she got lost, possibly separated from her family somehow on a walk. Maybe she was a runaway, though nobody reported a missing child. They were finishing up their search of the beach when the lead officer's partner tapped him on the shoulder and pointed out into the water. The lead officer looked, and there in the water was the little girl. Later on, he was telling a story to other officers. He told them when he saw her, all the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. She was standing in about ankle-deep water, wearing an old-fashioned white nightgown that sat just above the surface of the water. 2 officers looked at each other, knowing something wasn't quite right about this situation, but not totally certain what it was. They radioed into dispatch, stating they'd found the girl and approached as close as they could get. She didn't respond to their movement, so the lead officer knelt down near the edge of the water and held out his arms to her like he would to his own daughter. He said, "I'm a policeman. Come on out of the water, honey. It's not safe in there." The girl turned and looked at the officers, and her eyes were described as oddly vacant. She started walking toward the officer that called her. And as she did so, another patrol car arrived near the scene, and the new officers walked to the beach to see her walking toward the first officer. She got just outside the arm's reach and just vanished, 1 minute to the next. All that remained was a series of small footprints in the mud near him. 4 officers from different angles saw this happen. None of them can explain what happened, but 2 years later there was a similar circumstance in which a little girl in a white nightgown was seen at the lake. She vanished as well, and now legend is the little girl haunts the lake. What she wants or why she's there is still a mystery. Well, sometimes, especially in cities, you get a lot of domestic violence reports. And this one came from a poor inner city area known for high amounts of crime and prostitution and human trafficking and a lot of drug-related violence. Neighbors in the residential complex initially phoned in the call as they heard screaming and banging. Well, the police arrived on the scene and found 7 people, mostly from the families that lived in the complex, out on the grass, praying silently. The officers heard the people mumbling under their breath as though they didn't want to disturb someone. When they asked what the prayers were doing, one answered, "Praying for our souls." Well, this unsettled the officers, immediately set the tone for what was to come next. They went into the apartment, and they were headed for where the man had been reported, and they were directed to a room where a member of the family was apparently possessed. Now, they were skeptical, thinking this was probably a drug-related incident, so they went to assess the situation. They reached the door and realized there were multiple voices coming from the room, although they were advised there was only one man inside. Screaming it sounded like two people screaming at one another in languages neither of the officers recognized. Well, sensing the situation was outside of their expertise, the lead officer called for backup, and EMTs for a potentially serious psychological incident showed up. While waiting for backup to arrive, the officers questioned the family about the man. Apparently, he'd been acting odd for weeks, becoming anxious and agitated over minuscule things and progressively more haggard and pale as if he was ill. About a half hour before the police got there, he started screaming he's going to eat his family and be dragged back to hell because he'd broken the agreement. Well, next he started begging the Virgin Mary to save him and began to foam at the mouth, burning himself with holy candles. Family managed to stop him and move him into another room, but he'd become more violent to the point that they couldn't control him any longer. One family member said they'd given up when he climbed up the walls onto the ceiling. And as the family retold the story, the man continued to scream so piercingly in unknown languages that the walls were actually shaking. All the officers involved in the incident were highly experienced, longtime members of the force, but even a lot of them were starting to come unglued. One officer even passed a rosary through his fingers to comfort himself, while the rest managed to keep a lid on their fears. When the EMTs and the backup arrived, they headed upstairs with the officers to the man's room. They tried the door, but the man locked himself in, forcing the officers to break the door down. They discovered the room completely upturned, almost everything knocked over and covered in bloody foam from the man's mouth. There's one desk lamp still working and casting shadows of strange shapes that seemed to transform when they were looked directly at. After the officers were sure nobody else was in the room, the EMTs moved in to try to calm the man down. He was huddled in the corner of the room, hunched up in a squat like an animal over a fresh kill. And he was rambling under his breath, as if he was talking to an invisible figure. One of the medics said his name, and the man's head picked up in a way like a dog does, just a movement of the head and neck with no self-consciousness about his movements. A couple of the officers put their hands onto their guns at that point, natural reaction, sensing an imminent threat. Undisturbed by this, but still trying to remain calm, the medic asked the man how he was feeling. The man smiled and said in Spanish, "God himself won't recognize you when I'm done with you." Well, at that point, the officers and the medics made a unanimous agreement to take the man into custody quickly, but as they were discussing the situation, the man stood up, breathing heavily. From the scratch marks on his body, it was clear he'd been clawing at himself, and his chest was covered in bloody foam from his mouth. Smiling again, he looked at the rosary that the one officer had hanging from his chest, and he said, "That trinket's not going to save you." And then he rushed them. Well, despite it being just one man against six, they had a major fight on their hands. The first officer the man got to tackled him to the ground as the others jumped in to pile on top and stop him through sheer weight alone. And that man fought wildly and scratching and punching and struggling like a cornered animal, screaming at him the whole time. Eventually, they did manage to subdue him enough for one of the medics to prepare a syringe to sedate him. Well, as the medic was doing this, the lead officer was holding the man's arms over his head, made eye contact with him. And then that officer began to cry out in horror and released the captive's arms and rolled away from the man like he was truly disturbing. In response, the man stopped struggling, gave a deep belly laugh, made everybody in the room shiver, and said to that officer, "Look closely so you don't forget." Well, the medic managed to get the syringe ready and sedated the man enough for the others to get him onto a back stretcher and strap him down before they took him out to the ambulance. The officer made eye contact with the man, was white as a sheet, and refused to ride in the same ambulance with him, opting to follow in the patrol car. Another officer rode in the ambulance and with the medics, and as he told it, he never took his hand off his gun the entire time. When he got to the hospital, the officer made eye contact and went to the chapel to pray. Later, when one of his fellow officers asked him what he saw, he said his eyes weren't human. I know what I saw. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Just keep in mind there's a lot of strange things out there. So until tomorrow at this time, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.